Well, hey there. You're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On this episode, we're talking all things Alberta agriculture. And as farmers and producers across the province start their seeding and calving seasons, we're taking a journey to explore the tumultuous 2021 season, the state of various sectors today, and what we can expect in the coming year, especially as the war in Ukraine and existing supply chain issues continue to put pressure on the global food supply chain. And we're joined by JP Gervais, the Chief Economist at Farm Credit Canada, to walk us through all these topics and more. Thanks so much for joining the show, JP. We're really excited to talk about ag and the opportunity in Alberta and just kind of what's going on in the global context, and just to get your thoughts on where we've been, where we are today, and kind of where we're going. But before we get into that conversation, can you just give us a super quick elevator pitch of who you are, what you do? And I think the most important part of that is kind of why you do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm a chief economist at Farm Credit Canada. FCC is a federal crown corporation. And what we do is basically support agribusinesses, farm operations, food processors, and growing their businesses. So we're supporting them with lending solutions and offering capital to these businesses so that they can grow. And my role as a chief economist at FCC, well, an economist, as the joke goes, is somebody who's an expert at explaining or at knowing tomorrow why the predictions he made yesterday did not come true today, right? But more seriously, though, I mean, my role is to look after everything that is related to the external environment of our customers and businesses that we deal with, right? So anything that is not under the control of the businesses that we work with, I call this the external operating environment. And so we make projections, look at the scenarios. And so it's explaining in words and numbers that, make sense and that our business and our customers can use what is going on in the world. And, you have to be comfortable with being wrong in this role, because you're going to be wrong a lot. Hopefully, you get a few things right. That helps from time to time, and especially with credibility. But I just enjoy economics because it gives you the tools to explain a number of different things that are going on in the world. And so that's just a powerful medium for me to use and communicate what's going on in the operating environment.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe we should print out that joke and put it in our chief economist office.
There you go. He's gonna like it too.
So the narrative theme for this episode is kind of looking at ag, particularly in Alberta and I guess Canada a little bit more broadly, and looking at the past, present, and future. And so let's start by anchoring ourselves in 2021. It was a hard year for Alberta producers. There were very prolonged periods of drought, lower yields, but also kind of mixed in with a little bit of optimism. So can you walk us through maybe the good, the bad, the ugly of Alberta's ag sector in 2021?
Yeah, I do think that you mentioned the ugly, which is the drought and the reduction in yields, losses in production. If you look at, overall in the prairies, you're looking at around 40% decline in production for 2021 relative to what was expected, going into the year. So I think that's the ugly part of the year. I mean, the bad, I would say, is still the COVID disruptions that we went through this year, right? It's not ugly as it would have been in 2020. I think we learned quite a bit in 2020. And then in 2021, we've still had some disruptions. If you look at packing plants, if you look at transportation, that were somewhat COVID related, and some food services shut down as well in different parts of the country and elsewhere in the world as well. So I think we learned a great deal and we became more resilient in 2020. So I wouldn't classify that as ugly, but certainly I don't think it was good. I think we still had to deal with COVID, and hopefully now the worst is behind us. But there is some positive for sure. I mean, if you look at cash receipts, which is sort of the benchmark we use to look at the health of the farm sector, livestock receipts went up 13% in Alberta, and crop receipts went up around 20%, a little bit less than that. I mean, I believe the number is 19% on top of my head. So why would we see gross revenues go up if as I said, and you did say as well, we had loss of yields and so forth, right? And that's a really good question. So a number of different reasons. First, we had higher prices, drought in other parts of the world, really tight supply. So we had really elevated prices. And so that offset some of the losses in yields that we had as well. 2021, we have to realize as well that we're part marking the crop that we grew in 2020, as well as marketing the crop that we are growing in 2021. So we had that little bit of a boost, coming from 2020 into 2021. We front loaded some of the shipments that we would normally do throughout the marketing year. So front loaded them in the last few months of 2021. So all of that was actually a pretty positive picture, considering that, it was, as you said, at the farm level, it was pretty difficult for a lot of operations, and some operations really had it really hard. It was really difficult, but overall, I think on the gross revenue side of things, I think it was positive, and I think that speaks to the strength of demand that we face when it comes to commodities that we're growing here in Alberta and across the country.
Absolutely. Well, let's shift gears on that theme of strength and demand and bring us into the present a little bit. I always find it so enjoyable to talk about agriculture and food because it's the one human constant, and one area that Canadians, Albertans, many people are really feeling the squeeze at the moment is inflation and food prices. We're talking about inflation all over the map, high inflation rates of 4 or 5%, but at the grocery store, many people are saying it feels like a lot more than that for key items. JP, from your perspective, would you tell us a little bit about how serious you feel that issue is and what you might think is causing it?
Yeah, no, this is a very serious issue. And I did say towards the end of 2021, I was putting emphasis on the fact that, look, we have some measurement issues. Nobody likes to talk too much about statistics, but it matters in this case because this is a really big problem. And we have to understand whether or not we should be aggressive dealing with it, or we should just step back and let it play out. And at the end of, towards, the last quarter of 2021, I was saying, hey, let's not forget that in 2020, prices were really low. We had no inflation. So we were measuring inflation in 2021 off some lower prices. And so that was that right. COVID effect that we had to account for. But we can't say that anymore. And this is going to be challenging it's going to be a challenge by the Bank of Canada to deal and fight off inflation the way that it's running. There are too many supply chain disruptions and supply chain disruptors at play right now that you can't expect this problem to go away on its own. So we're going to have to lift interest rates, and that's going to have some serious consequences for businesses, and they're going to have to adapt. And this is something definitely to monitor as well going into in 2022.
I really, I think it's a serious issue, as you do as well. And I worry that some of the prescriptions are going to make it worse in the short run too, in some ways, for average families who feel like they're spending more on food. If interest rates go up, they might feel like they're spending more on their variable line of credit or something like that as well. So I think it's something we really have to keep an eye on.
Definitely. Two ways, right, to fight off inflation. You slow demand or you increase supply, but increasing supply takes time. And when you want to increase supply, you need to increase business investment. And so if you're lifting rates while you want business investment to grow, that's difficult. So really, it seems to me anyway that we're going to have to slow down inflation by slowing down demand. And that means raising costs for Canadian households overall. And that's, some businesses are going to feel the pinch, and some pinch from this for sure.
I'd like to turn our attention to the geopolitical environment. As we're recording this, tragic events are continuing to play out in Ukraine. And in addition to the human tragedy, this has implications on global agriculture markets. And so I guess I'll just ask you kind of in an open-ended way, how do you think the events in Ukraine and the knock-on effects that it's having are going to affect Canadian agriculture this year and in the next couple of years? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, this is a super fascinating, as you said, tragic story, but as well, from a market standpoint, it has tons of implications as well. First of all, we have to realize that putting aside the war in Ukraine, which I said is very tragic, we were going into this year, 2022, in a very tight environment. If you look at inventories we had in the world markets compared to what the strength of demand was, we had most commodities that were running way higher than the 5-year average. So we were already in an environment in which supply was really tight compared to what was expected to be consumed in world markets. And so now fast forward to this, and right now the situation that Ukraine finds itself in. Ukraine is a large wheat exporter. Russia is the #1 wheat exporter. Ukraine's #5. We're #4. So obviously you've seen the price movement in the wheat market that have been really significant, but it's not just wheat. Right? It's all those different connections that exist in the global market. And my favorite example is this. I mean, I don't think there's not a whole lot of discussion around the fact that Ukraine is the #4 largest exporter of corn. So behind the United States, Argentina, and Brazil. So now you think of China now, after many years dealing with African swine fever, China is the largest pork supplier in the world, accounts for normally half of the world's supply of pork. Now they're rebuilding their pig populations, and they're now starting to have some success, as I said, dealing with African swine fever since 2018. So if they're rebuilding, they need more feed grains. And now you find yourself in a situation in which the demand is so large, potentially, that the markets are trying to ration that demand, right? And that means higher prices. And so, of course, the war is going to have an impact, and the longer it lasts, just thinking about what Ukrainian farmers are going to have to face in terms of decisions, in terms of their seeding decisions for this next crop, and this is going to be really difficult for them. And the mix of crop is going to change. I mean, they're surely not going to be able to seed as much as before. Fertilizer needs are going. I mean, a lot of uncertainty with regards to this. It's all of that puts the world in a very difficult spot when it comes to food supply. Definitely.
Well, and to ask the really sharp question there, JP, do you think we're at risk of food shortages this year and in the year ahead?
Well, I mean, certainly I would see that there's some serious food security issues in the developing world. In the developed world, so if you think of Canada, North America, Europe, and so forth, I mean, I still think that we're not going to have some significant food shortages, but inflation is not going to slow down, unfortunately. I think from a food standpoint, the higher commodity prices are going to feed into the supply chain, and food processors, retailers are not going to have much of a choice but to pass on some of those additional costs to consumers. And so that raises the pricing, or the inflation itself, I think, raises, not from a food availability standpoint in terms of shortages, but the food inflation itself, I do think, is raising some red flags for us in Canada in terms of food security, because I mean, we're very fortunate. I mean, we are one of the nations that allocate the smallest share of its disposable income to food purchases, which is one thing that I think as an industry, we don't celebrate enough. I think the fact that Canadians have access to a safe, high quality supply of food at a very affordable price, if you compare ourselves to other Western nations. But having said that, higher prices, I mean, we're not food secure at 100%, right? We have some populations, a segment of the populations here in Canada that are not food insecure. And so I'm afraid that higher prices are going to certainly raise some red flags in terms of potential food security issues here in Canada as well.
And there's the exact issue, food security. This is the first time in a very long time that I've heard people talking about food security in developed countries, and especially considering food security, also what it means in terms of sort of geopolitical security. And in the last number of weeks, I've been getting calls from, and I'm sure you have too, government representatives, even sometimes representatives from other nations, kind of asking a simple question: how much more food could Canada grow and produce? What's your answer to that?
Well, not a whole lot. I mean, short term. I mean, long term, it's a different story. It really depends on the horizon. I mean, short term, given some of the challenges, if you think of the tools that we have at our disposal, increase food supply in the short term, it's quite limited, right? So you can, fertilizer can play a role, but again, the availability of fertilizer is a lot of question marks around this, perhaps more in the eastern part of the country than in the prairies, but nonetheless, I do think that's an issue. I mean, the cost of production being really high as well sort of puts around questions on the ability of producers. That I think we're going to do as much as we can, but I do think that at the margin, this is not going to be that significant short term. And I think it does highlight, I mean, one of the unique feature of this industry, of this supply chain, if you compare the food supply chain with other supply chains in the overall economy, it's this lag in between the moment we make production decisions and the moment we consume. A lot can happen in between. For now, for example, I think seeding decisions are pretty much locked in. I mean, there might be a few operations that have a little bit of room to tweak a few of their plans, whatnot. But I mean, by and large, I think those seeding decisions are locked in. And if we were to be able to reset all of this, we would probably observe a few different decisions, made at the farm level. Now it's a little bit too late, and so this lag in between production decisions and consumption really is what gets in the way, for example, in responding really fast. Having said that, I do think that Canada has a major role, and there's a major opportunity for us as well to play a major role in terms of food security, alleviating some of those food security concerns in the world. And because I mean, our reputation, our productivity, just our overall potential from a productive capacity standpoint, I do think that there's a major opportunity here to leverage that to the extent that we can, and really just build on that reputation and start growing even more.
So let's talk about that. How do we capitalize on that opportunity? What's it going to take? You said over the more like the medium to long term to really achieve our full potential. And what gets you excited? What is going to create greater food production capacity in Canada?
Well, I mean, we got tons of potential technology that we can bring on the farm. We can bring into our food processing plants and actually help us, gain some productive capacity. But economists have one pretty neat tool, which is called the total factor or total productivity factor. And what it does, basically, it measures our overall productivity. So we can increase production by using more inputs. But in a world where we are concerned by, their sustainability concerns and so forth, right? That's not always the obvious solution if you want to increase production. So you have to use your inputs in a more efficient way. And that you bring in technology, you bring in innovation and so forth. And if you look at our total factor productivity, that measure, that one measure to aggregate how we're doing at the farm level when it comes to our productivity, our ability to make more by using less inputs. Well, that measure over the last 40 years is still trending up. So we're growing our productivity, but at a slower pace. I think that's the key thing here, is that the low-hanging fruits are gone when it comes to technology. We've been super productive. We can, be proud of everything that we achieve as an industry. And I think if we look to the future, I mean, we're seeing our rate of productivity grow slowly decline. And so again, we're more productive every year, but at a slower pace. And so if we find a way to revert this and then flip this on its head and say, hey, can we gain back, the 2% growth per year that we had in productivity? Like we're right around between 1 and 1.5% now. We used to be in the 80s, 3%. And that makes sense, right? I mean, like I said, the low-hanging fruits are gone. If you look at all the emerging suppliers, Brazil, so on, they're able to gain productivity a lot faster than we are because they are not as advanced. But so that's our challenge. But I do think if we bring in more innovation, if we are working together as a supply chain and so forth, I do think that's the opportunity for us, to grow production.
You mentioned inputs, JP. I want to ask your thoughts on one input in particular. I'm not sure if it's as widely known as it should be that Alberta and Saskatchewan, Canada is home to the world's largest fertilizer company. We were talking about the geopolitical disruptions. Russia also produces quite a lot of fertilizer. When we think about the fertilizer markets, the input markets, how much of that market share do you think that Canada might be able to displace over time?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I do think I'm not so sure as the potential to displace the Russian market or to steal a bit of market share. Well, it might have potential for sure over the longer term. If you think of our own, because it speaks to reliability, right? So if you think of our own issues in the past, we, for example, were asking a lot of questions around our own reliability when we had this huge bumper crop, lots of transportation issues that emerged on the prairies, and we were not able to get product to the export ports and the market as we would have liked and so forth. It was raising tons of concerns around our own reliability as an exporter. Anytime there's a disruption as well in terms of the supply chain, the ability to move product, every time we're raising good questions around, is this an issue? And most of the time, yes, it is an issue short term, but long term, the demand is such that it's, we gain back that market share, and people our buyers understand that, hey, yeah, it was just a more short-term issue.
disruptions.
Now, I think fertilizer, we might see some of the same issue. I think for oil, maybe a bit of a different story. I mean, the Russian oil industry is going to be set back a whole lot, even if no further sanctions are imposed on Russia. So I do think that from an energy standpoint, it might be a little bit of a different story. From a fertilizer standpoint, I would just like to see how it plays out a little bit beyond this year to be able to say, well, yeah, you know what, perhaps, there's a bit of market share that we can gain. I'm sure there is. I'm just not sure that the market is going to move really fast away from Russia once, we're hopefully putting this behind us really soon.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit more about the future. What are your observations or outlook for the year ahead I guess a few areas, particularly the ones that matter to Albertans, like livestock and crops and oilseeds, grains, value-added processing, etc. What are you seeing, or what are you hearing from your clients, from producers, about what we can expect for 2022 or 2023?
Yeah, well, both. I mean, it's, if you're looking at the next couple of years, I mean, it's really hard not to be bullish on grains and oilseeds and pulses. I mean, if you look at prices, I think the challenge is going to be, hey, profitability. How can I manage my inputs so that I make sure that I have a decent return on the investment? But overall, I think the demand is going to be tremendous. I am even more bullish on vegetable oil. So anything oil seeds, to me, if you look at some of the very aggressive mandate when it comes to biodiesel, renewable diesel that have been set elsewhere in the world, for example, in California, if you look at some of the production challenges and from a sustainability standpoint in some parts of Asia that are a very large producer of oil seeds, all of that point towards really, really strong demand. So anything that we'll be able to supply the market, it will absorb it domestically as well in foreign markets. So I'm super bullish. I mean, plant-based proteins is we have a huge competitive edge when it comes to plant-based proteins as well. We're investing in a lot more value add as well. So to your point about value add, so this is both from a vegetable oil standpoint and pulse markets. I mean, that's also a pretty bullish scenario when it comes to plant-based proteins and vegetable oil. Livestock is going to be challenging, in the short term, especially given sort of the profitability outlook that we have with really high feed costs on the horizon. That's going to be difficult. But beef, I'll speak to beef because I find beef fascinating, because right now we're running right around 17% inflation year over year for beef at the grocery store. This is huge.
Wow.
Yet, if you account for that high price, you account for everything else that you can account of, like disposable income of consumers, export, imports, price of competing meats, all that stuff. And you take that all away. That's what we have, an index of what we call consumer preference. And what this index, when you strip it out, you strip out all these other factors from this index, what you're left with is consumer willingness to buy beef. And that index has been trending up. So if we are to see consumption come down in the next so many months because of high prices, because at some point, consumers are going to move away from high price meats. Yeah. Exactly, right? I mean, it's just good economics. I wouldn't I'm afraid that people are going to point this out of declining beef consumption and declining this, because that's usually what the story is. But I just don't buy it. I mean, consumers want to eat beef. It's just that at some point it's not affordable. But I just don't think that it means that, it's going to be a bearish type of scenario for an extended period of time. I think as soon as we can get inflation under control, I think there's a pretty positive outlook to me, because consumers want to eat beef. Like after many, many years of declining per capita consumption, I think last year was flat, but we had 2 consecutive years of positive growth. So I'm positive, yet I want to acknowledge that this is going to be tough, from a profitability standpoint in 22. That's for sure.
So we were talking about inputs and using our inputs more efficiently through innovation, technology. Are you seeing any, increase in investment in technology, or, some more interest in just, like I said, an uptake of new technology from producers?
Definitely. I think the message I was or what I was talking about just moments ago in terms of our productivity still increasing, but at a slower rate, I think it's a really difficult message for businesses to receive because they've made tons of investment. We see it on a daily basis here at FCC. So, but having said that, we have some challenges in front of us, right? So, labor, to me, is the number one challenge we have to sort out. I mean, period. I mean, if you look at job vacancies in the food processing level, compared to pre-pandemic, I think they nearly doubled. Compared to 5 years ago, I think we're at 170% more job vacancies. This is going to become a major issue at the farm level. Our farm operators have been able and successfully sort of mitigate some of the labor shortages that we've seen, with different ways. But at the food processing level, especially if we're talking value add, this is something that we're going to have to solve. So what are the solutions, right? So we were talking about technology, innovation. Well, any type of technology that is labor substituting, in the sense that, can I automate? Can I robotize? So I would like, for us as a country, as an industry, to be a little bit more aggressive. But again, the technology is expensive. I mean, it requires to bring the technology in your business. It requires a degree of expertise. You need to be sure as well to get the technology serviced as well, which is a huge issue at a time of COVID, for example, in terms of some of the technology that might be coming from Europe. Well, are you going to be able to get the servicing the technology and the equipment that you brought in your plant? So all of these issues, but I do think that labor is, I think, on my radar, the number one issue that we're going to have to solve. And it's not going to be just one solution. It's not just going to be technology. It's going to be immigration. It's going to be a number of different things. But I think that's the number one thing that, if we think of inputs, I think we need to be putting on our radar.
Absolutely. You said something a few moments ago that I wanted to ask you more about. You said that we have natural advantages in plant-based proteins. I'm interested if you could unpack that a little bit more for our audience, for our listeners. What is it that Canada has that makes us a natural fit, natural advantage in this area?
Well, first of all, the know-how and the endowments. I mean, we are endowed with some of the best land in the world. And so I do think that right then, I do think that gives us an advantage. We have endowments of water as well that we can leverage and deploy. We are just getting started in that sense. So I think, to me, there are two quite big natural advantages that we have, and as well the expertise. And when I think of plant-based, even more so, I would say, than vegetable oils, which is another sort of opportunity that I identified earlier. When I think of plant-based proteins, to me, it starts with the consumer. And this is, the most significant shift that I've seen in my career. I assume I started out in '95 in this role, or in a similar role, not with FCC, but in a similar role. The most significant shift that I've seen is this shift in the supply chain, moving from what I used to call a push supply chain to a pull supply chain. So in other words, in ag and food, what it was before is this is what I have on the farm. I'm growing it. I'm turning around. I'm talking to buyers. Say, hey, this is what I have. What is it worth? Buyer says, oh, I will give you this. I'm not happy. I'll take it. And then the buyer does the same thing all the way to the consumer. But now, we flip the supply chain on its head, and now it's really a pull, and the consumer is driving 100% of it. And so it's all about farm operators making sure that they know and they get the signals that consumers are sending, right? So I think there's huge opportunities there. I wanted to grow and listening to some of the signals in terms of some of the diversity in food diet, and to say that, consumers want a more diverse food diet. Going back to what we were talking about in terms of opportunities for red meats, for example, I think it's actually a strength of ours as an industry that we have the diversity of. There's quite a bit of diversity in terms of food preferences now that we can actually leverage in a number of different ways. And so, and with plant-based as well, there's the opportunity when it comes to fractioning and so forth to really add value, really build an ingredient strategy, for example, in Canada and so forth, that will help, other further processors develop their own products and so forth. So I think there's just a lot of potential economic ripple effects that are very positive for the plant-based industry.
Yeah, that's great to hear, actually, and especially from a Western Canadian perspective. I've noticed a change over the last few years in how people are thinking about plant-based foods and diversity within the diet. I like that you put it that way, because Alberta, we raise a lot of cattle in Alberta, and so the prospect of plant-based burgers was perhaps a little bit scary to begin with, but now that's really kind of flipped. I think that the view and the language that we're hearing is not about vegetarian or vegan diets per se. It's about having a diversity of foods in our diets, and actually many of the businesses that we work with and the producers that we talk to, produce meat-based inputs and plant-based inputs, and can see the opportunity for themselves in both areas. Do you think that trend towards consumers demanding more plant-based proteins, is that only set to continue?
I think so. I do think that, the pandemic kind of introduced a little bit of noise in all the studies that we had, or the data that we were collecting, right? Because you have to how much of what you're seeing in the data is actually just some sort of a transition towards this new normal post-pandemic world where people have started to cook more at home, but also now they want to go out and have more. So until we reach that equilibrium, well, it's hard for me to say, oh, well, we expect a growth rate of so-and-so. But I think there is more growth on the horizon. As I said, I do think that diversity in the food supply chain is, because we're talking about diversity from the perspective of plant-based versus traditional meat, protein, and so forth. But we can talk about some of the different sustainability initiatives. We can talk about different production characteristics, whether it's cage-free eggs or there's just a number of different things. And I think in Canada, we realize as well that it's not just about scale anymore. Because it used to be that we were competing against the US from a scale standpoint, which when you think about it, back in the days, I don't think we had this discussion, but when you think about it, I don't think this was very smart, right? We were saying, hey, how can we scale this up so that we have the economies of scale that will be relatively similar to the US. Now, of course, in some we got some very large businesses in Canada, and there are some producers that are all about scale, and that's fine. But I think what I'm saying, the positive in all of that is that there's also all this other part of the business and the supply chain that is developing with regards to, maybe we can be smaller in terms of scale, but maybe we offer something different to buyers and all the way to consumers. And I think that, to me, is sort of the gain that we've had in the supply chain that was worked well for us here in Canada. I made a number of pre-pandemic, I made a number of different food shows, that involve food processors showcasing different products. The degree of innovation when it comes to, again, the product innovation, forget about the process, which we talked briefly about, bringing in new technology and so forth, but the product innovation part of this, it's pretty amazing. And that makes us proud, should make us proud anyway, as an industry, to be offering that level of diversity when it comes to products.
It absolutely should. We spent so much of this conversation, as I love to, talking about opportunities for us. Let's talk about the risks a little bit. Where are the storm clouds on the horizon? What keeps you up at night sometimes, JP? That's what I want to know. You mentioned a few things already. You mentioned labor maybe as one of the number one issues. What else is there?
Yeah, well, at the moment, it's hard to ignore as well the level of unpredictability in the world right now, and inflation, and the ability for us to contain inflation. Because if you look at it from a business standpoint, now what I'm hearing is a lot of businesses are thinking about their operational side of the business. Like, how can I mitigate, contain inflation? And how can I make sense of the investment plans that I had on the books that I was maybe ready to just deploy? And given all that volatility, the fact that I am just struggling to keep costs under control, and that level of unpredictability is never good for businesses, right? And so I think that's the one thing that I ignore. I have no knowledge, and as I, like everybody else, right? When are we going to be able to put a lid on this? But if you think of the growth that we've had as an industry, a lot of it was driven by foreign trade, exporting more and so forth, building up our trade balance and so forth, expanding our trade balance. And that actually takes its roots at, sort of the very successful trade agreements that we had, right? So when we had trade agreements where we brought ag and food within the WTO and all those good things with NAFTA, CUSMA, trade deal with Europe, although it hasn't materialized, or offered all the benefits that we thought initially, but nonetheless, I think all of that sort of gave a level of predictability to businesses that they say, yeah, I can invest in developing export markets, for example, and I can invest developing some more products for domestic consumers. Now, I think, we have to question that. So to me, that's one of the big challenge right now. And I think we haven't cracked yet the challenge of bringing in more technology and innovation. So, and I don't know what this involves in terms of solving this, but I think that maybe we don't have enough of a broad perspective as a supply chain, thinking of our equipment manufacturers as being part of the supply chain, thinking of R&D upstream as being part of the supply chain. And maybe we need to be a little bit more cohesive in terms of how we're going to be solving challenges together as an industry. So I think that's something as well that I'm, thinking about these days. But I think the future is bright. The underlying fundamentals for the industry are absolutely great. It's just a matter of how can we execute and how can we just get over some of the challenges that are very real for sure.
As we move to close, I have just a few final questions for you. If you could wave a magic wand, what is one thing that you would like to do that you think would really have an impact on Alberta producers, that would really help them produce the best insert product here?
I would love to do a number of things, but if I'm just asked one thing, I'm going to pick something that we haven't talked about just yet, and that's going to be transportation and logistics.
Yeah.
If we were to realize how much it accounts for in our competitiveness when we bring a product from Alberta to name a city in China or wherever else, and then we would think of, yeah, exactly. If we were to think how much of it is transportation and logistics, I think maybe that would sort of give us a little bit of a different mindset. And if I had that magic wand, I would say, hey, let's just resolve all of that. Because we're talking, let's face it, when we think transportation and logistics, we're talking a lot of capital, and that takes time. And if we were to have that magic wand and make it the way that we want it, the more efficient, highly innovative, technology advanced transportation sector, I think that would be awesome, and that would make a huge difference in terms of overall competitiveness of Alberta food and ag products.
Oh, completely. What makes you excited for the future of Canadian ag?
Just the role of consumers. Like it's one thing to say, hey, we're growing, but we don't seem to be growing in line with what consumers want. But we have a direct line of sight to consumers now, which we didn't have, as I said, some years ago. I don't know, was it 10 years or 20 years, but I definitely changed. And so if you look at the food demand in the world, this high, we keep talking about the middle class and so forth, but it's so true. I remember the study that now is a few years old for sure, that came from the USDA, and it was looking at, how much money, when you have $1 of income in your pocket in different countries, how much of that money actually goes to food? In Canada, it was roughly 10 cents. Maybe now it's a little bit more with inflation. That 10 cents, okay, that's fine. But as Canadians, a lot of that 10 cents of an additional $1 of income goes to food services, and nothing wrong with that, good stuff. But if you think of it from a food processing or farm operating standpoint, or agribusinesses that supply inputs, what is really paying off is when we have that additional $1 of income in the pockets of consumers that are spending 30 cents of it on food. And so China is an example, right? Multiply that by the size of their population. So to me, that's not going to go away. All that volatility in the marketplace and everything that's going on from a geopolitical standpoint, that creates a bit of noise, and it sort of hides a lot of the fundamentals that are very positive. So that direct line of sight to consumers, whether it's domestic, in their sophistication and so forth of their food preferences, or whether it's foreign, to me, that's what still makes me quite excited about the future of the industry.
One final question for you. What is one idea or insight that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, that's a super good question. So one of the things that I've started to say more and more lately is be like a CEO. What I mean by that is if you think of a CEO in any type of large business, the CEO is not the expert at everything. The CEO will surround himself or herself with experts in marketing, legal, finance, HR. And so if we were to develop this a little bit more at the farm level in Canada and have that CEO mindset and saying, hey, I don't need to do it all on my farm. I can surround what am I really good at? And do I spend a little bit more time on strategic goals for my business? What is the goals 5 years from now? What do I want for my business? And there are a number of different good answers there, right? It really depends on what the objectives of the business owners are. But if we were to behave a little bit more like CEO, surround yourself with good partners, surround yourself with the partners that can take you to that next level and can lead you to execute that strategy. You don't have to do it all yourself. And I think maybe, if we were to let go of some of that mindset of I want to do it all and I need to be an expert at everything, be more like a CEO would be my final thought. I do think that there's room to grow for us still, even despite all the success we've had.
Be like a CEO. What a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, JP, for joining us today and for all of your insights.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. You can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And if you liked this episode and want to support our message of shared prosperity for all, please be sure to head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.